So in our last week's story, if you remember Pastor John's message from last week, we saw how David was not in a good place, right? He was a fugitive. He was being chased by Saul and his men. He was literally fearing for his life. He was hiding in the wilderness, in the desert, in caves, and life was not good for him. He was in constant danger. He probably didn't have a chance to really rest for any long period of time anywhere because he would, be in constant move from one place to another, trying to evade capture. But fast forward to this week's story, and we see how a lot of things have changed in David's life. For example, now he is the king. Saul, of course, some of you might know the story, eventually dies along with his son Jonathan in battle against the Philistines. And David eventually, as predicted by God and Prophet Samuel, becomes the next king of Israel. And he becomes king. He even captures the city of Jerusalem, where he establishes his palace. And he settled into the palace. And really, from just a worldly perspective, David has made it. He's gone from being a nobody, just a small shepherd boy from a obscure town called Bethlehem, to becoming the most powerful man in Israel. In fact, eventually, when he is able to defeat his enemies, the Philistines, and all the other nations around Israel that traditionally have been attacking and just bothering Israel, he conquers all the surrounding nations and eventually becomes the most powerful man in all of Canaan and the Middle East. He's gone from being in constant danger of being in a palace of safety and security. He went from hiding out in caves and living in the desert, sleeping outside, to being in a comfortable palace. And so after David settles into his new palace in Jerusalem, the next thing he does is he brings in the Ark of the Covenant. So recall, the Ark used to be in the tabernacle, but that was stolen, or that was captured by the Philistines during the reign of Saul and Prophet Eli. And eventually, the Ark is returned, but it just kind of stayed in various places without really any permanent home, until David again brings the Ark back into the city of Jerusalem. And because there still wasn't any permanent place for them to place the Ark of the Covenant, the tabernacle at this point has been destroyed, he pitches a tent. He pitches a temporary shelter for the Ark, and he places the Ark of the Covenant there. But he doesn't feel good about the arrangement. Right? And you can read this at the beginning of chapter 7 of 2 Samuel, where he says to the prophet Nathan, here I am, living in this beautiful palace, and while God's Ark, and in a way, God is living in a tent, right? It's kind of like, if I'm living in a nice, beautiful mansion, and my parents are living in a tent in my backyard, that kind of arrangement here. And David understandably feels guilty about it, and he feels like this is not right. And so at the beginning of 2 Samuel, he says to the prophet Nathan, hey, I think I should build a temple, a proper building for God and his Ark. And the rest of the passage that were read wonderfully today is the response that God gives to David when David thinks about possibly building a temple, a permanent residence for God. and in this story, we see how David, thinks that somehow he is in a better position than God was. Right? It's almost as if David feels pity for God, and he feels like there's this obligation for him to, quote unquote, take care of his needs. But of course, when we think about it, does God really need David's care? Does God need anything to be done for him? And God responds to David with this question when he says, "Are you the one to build me a house to dwell in?" Right? It's almost a rhetorical question. This reminds me of the time when we bought furniture from IKEA. Yay, IKEA. It's great, it's cheap, lasts for a few years. Anyways, when you buy furniture for IKEA, the wonderful thing is that you got to, of course, assemble it. You got to put it all together, and you have to get the tools. You have to follow the instructions. Sometimes the instructions are a little ambiguous, and more often than not, you end up undoing some of the stages or steps because you kind of put the wrong parts in. Anyways, so when I was putting the furnitures together, Noah, who's at the time was probably like 4, he was just fascinated with tools and just like putting things together. And so he comes with a hammer. He comes with this whatever tool he could find in my toolbox, and he was like, "Dad, I'm gonna help you. I'm gonna do this for you. Can I do this for you? Okay, why don't you just like give me a chance?" And he was like so eager to put the IKEA furniture together. Well, what did I say to that question? I, being a responsible father, of course, said, "Thank you, but no thank you." You know, not only is it a little dangerous for you to be like lifting around, pieces of wood and playing with tools, but I don't think you're going to be able to be able to successfully put this together and make it work. And so I'll just do it for you, Noah. And of course, he was very disappointed. He was kind of upset, like that dad wouldn't let him, have a chance of playing with the tools and put the furniture together. But I almost feel like, that God probably kind of felt this when David comes to him and says, "Hey, God, can I build you a house? Because I kind of feel bad that you are just living in a tent right now, and I'm living in this wonderful palace. Let me, with my resources, with my know-how, let me do something for you. Let me build a house for you." And so how does God respond to this? Well, he responds, as we read in our passage today, by actually giving David a promise. He gives him a covenant. Now, we've seen a lot of covenants so far as we've gone through the book of the Old Testament, right? So there's a covenant that God makes with Noah. Of course, there's that covenant he makes with Abraham. And here we see another covenant, a promise that God gives to David in response to the question of, "Can I build you a house?" Now, this word covenant, again, simply means a promise. But I really like how John Piper describes covenant. And he describes covenant as God's self-written job description, where he lays out all the things that he is promising to do. As he says, "This is how I will work for you with all my heart, with all my soul, with all my strength, if you will love me as I am, cleave to me, and trust me to keep my word." So essentially, a covenant is a list of things that God himself is going to do out of his infinite and steadfast love, and often requiring nothing more than us trusting in this promise. And in fact, when you look at our scripture passage today, and you can do this as you follow along, but you can see the numerous I statements that God makes, where he lists out all the things that he himself is going to do, the things that God promised to do for David and his descendants. And you'll see that it's really all about what God is going to do, right? And so again, when David comes to God saying, "Hey, God, can I do something for you? Let me build you something." God responds with this incredible covenant, with a whole laundry list of things that God is going to do instead. And even though this particular covenant that we see in 2 Samuel chapter 7 is a very specific covenant that God makes with David, we can see a common element or theme that is found in all the covenants God has made with various people in the Bible, including the new covenant that he made with all of humanity through Jesus Christ. And I want us to look at some of these common themes or elements to remind us of the covenant that we have received, that we have been given from God through Christ, and what we can reflect on based on this promise that God makes with David. And so let's look, first of all, on the theme of God chooses us as we are. When God makes covenants, he chooses people out of his will, out of his sovereignty, and nothing based on what we have done. In a passage, God reminds David, hey, David, remember, I took you from the pasture, from following sheep. Remember, David, I chose you when you were a nobody. I chose you when you were just a little boy, an obscure shepherd boy in a small town in Bethlehem. I didn't choose you because you were a mighty warrior at that time. I didn't choose you because you necessarily did accomplish any great feats. But I chose you while you were just a boy, when you are a nobody. And I think this is one of the greatest or the most important theme of God's covenant. Right? When we can think about Abraham. Why did God choose Abraham? It was his choice. Why did God choose Noah? Why did God choose us? When God makes a covenant, he is not looking for a worthy covenant partner. He doesn't go through, a list of candidates on the list, and he kind of assesses who was worthy of receiving this wonderful promise and who is not, and he kind of interviews the potential candidates, and no, he doesn't do any of this. He simply selects those he chooses for himself, and not because of anything that we have done, not because we somehow deserve any of the things that God is wanting to give. He chooses us even in our sinful nature. The New Testament reminds us that while we were yet sinner, Christ died for us. That, the covenant that we have received from him does not rely on whether or not we can first make ourselves holy, whether we can, dress ourselves up, fix our problems, let go of our bad habits. He doesn't wait until we somehow accomplish things, but he chooses us where we are. He comes and finds us in the same way that God, through prophet Samuel, went and found David where he was, tending sheep. God, when he makes a covenant with us, seeks us out, finds us, and chooses us out of his grace and his mercy. God chooses us as we are. The second theme that we can look at and reflect on as we look at this covenant that God makes with David is that his covenant is all about God showering us with goodness. If there ever was a one-sided contract, God's covenants are one-sided contract, and it's one-sided for our advantage. And we see this again when we look at all the I statements, all the promises that God makes with David, where he says, I have been with you wherever you went, and I will make for you a great name. I will give you rest from your enemies. I will make you a house. I will raise you up an offspring after you, and I will establish his kingdom. And on it goes. There's nothing here in this covenant about what you are going to do, right? There is no condition to God's goodness that he promises. God's covenantal promises are always good, and they're always one-sided in our favor, in our advantage. And there's no strings attached. There's nothing that David had to do on his end. It doesn't say, David, when you build that temple that you said you're going to build, then I will do these things. It doesn't say anything about, if you promise to offer up a certain number of sacrifices every day, then I will give you these things. No, he just simply says, I have done this for you already, and I will do these things for you in the future. Notice how it is always good and always beneficial for us. As we go through the pandemic that we're going through these days, I'm sure some of you are going through challenges, physical, emotional, financial. And, as we, deal with, these things as well as other challenges that you have in your life, sometimes we forget about God's goodness. Sometimes we forget that God and his covenant for us is really all about us, all about how he wants to pour out his love and his goodness on us. And sometimes we kind of think or say to ourselves, hey, maybe we're going through these troubles or challenges. Maybe I'm going through these struggles because I somehow didn't meet my end of the bargain. Maybe God's punishing me for some of the things that I did. Or maybe this is a consequence of, the fact that I haven't been faithful. And yes, while it is true that sometimes, there are consequences to the sins and the mistakes and the bad choices that we make, but it is not true that God's goodness depends on our goodness. God in his promise is not one that says, I'm going to withhold these good things that I promised to you because you have not been good to me. And it's easy for us to, again, to think that maybe I need to do better. Maybe I need to do something for God. Maybe I need to build a house for God. And God will then bless me. But his covenant, his goodness, his faithfulness, and his love does not depend on our faithfulness and our goodness. It is always one-sided. It's always for our good. So first, we looked at how God's covenant is all about him choosing us where we are. It's also about God wanting to shower us with goodness and love. And lastly, we can see through this covenant that God makes with David, that God not only makes promises, not only makes these wonderful promises, but God fulfills all of his promises. God fulfills all of his promises. I don't know about you, but when I was growing up, there were times when my dad didn't keep his promises. Now it wasn't often. I'm not trying to say my dad was this terrible dad, wonderful dad. But there were times here and there where I still remember when he would make a promise, and for various reasons, and sometimes looking back now, I can understand why. There were some situations where things were beyond his control, and he just couldn't keep the promise he made. But I remember, as a child, how devastated I was, how disappointed I was, how angry I got when my dad would sometimes go back on his word and his promise. And that, at that time, not only hurts you as a child, but then it kind of, shakes your trust. You have a harder time trusting in the next promise that your dad makes, right? And you're like, part of you're like, I don't know. Like last time you made this promise, you kind of didn't keep it. So like, can I trust you with this? But you see, with God, his covenant, his promises, he always fulfills. There is not a single promise that God does not keep. And we can see how in David's covenant, how the covenant, with the covenant that God made with David, that in fact he does fulfill all the promises that he made. We know that David has a son, Solomon, who does eventually become the next king. And we know also that God blesses Solomon. Right? Most of us know that famous story of how God gives Solomon wealth and power, but on top of that, he gives Solomon wisdom, and Israel was at its like peak in terms of prosperity and peace during the reign of Solomon, and so God keeps the promise of establishing his throne and pouring out his love to his offspring. And what's also amazing is that God keeps this promise even though Solomon, unlike his father David, didn't necessarily stay true to God in his later days. As we'll see later when we read 1st and 2nd Kings, in fact, we'll see that most of the descendants of David after Solomon, most of the kings of Judah, with the exception of just a handful of kings, they all strayed away from God. That many of them committed evil, that they went after idols, and they completely ignored this covenant that was given to their forefather David. And as a consequence, we'll see, that eventually the kingdom of Judah, the house of David, is destroyed by the Babylonians. And some of us might say, what did God break his promise? Like, what happened? I thought God promised to David that your throne shall be established forever. Well, it just ended with the Babylonians coming, destroying Jerusalem, and taking the last king of Judah as hostage. What happened? Did God break his promise? But of course, again, we know that God fulfills his promise. And we know, fast forward a few thousand years, that Jesus Christ ultimately is the one who fulfills the covenant. And in a way, it is God himself, through Jesus Christ, fulfilling the promise that he made himself. For those of you who read the book of Matthew or book of Luke, you might have wondered, hey, why do they bother with this like long list of genealogy, right? So, for example, if you look at Matthew chapter 1, you look at a whole list of names starting from Abraham all the way down to Jesus. And you see a similar genealogy in the book of Luke, which is slightly different for various reasons that we don't really have time to talk about here. But the reason why these gospel writers includes the genealogy at the beginning or near the beginning of their gospel is to let the audience know, to let us know that God, in fact, fulfilled his promise that he made with David when Jesus Christ, the descendant of David, came and established God's kingdom. And so again, we can see how God's promise, even though at that moment might seem like it's not being fulfilled. In fact, the people of Israel might have looked at what's happening around them when the Babylonians were coming and they were under siege. They might have wondered, like, what's going on? I thought God fulfills his promises. I thought he is true to his promises, but we're about to end here. Our kingdom is about to come to an end. They might have wondered while they were in captivity, in exile, where is this God? I thought God keeps his promises. And maybe some of us are feeling like that these days when we, again, are going through some of the struggles that we are, where we wonder to ourselves and to God, hey, God, I thought you are good. I thought you are someone who fulfills your promises. What's going on here? And sometimes it might appear to us that God has forgotten about his promise. But when we see how Jesus not only comes to fulfill this promise that God has made, but also to give us a new covenant with the entire human race, a covenant that is written by his own blood, we can trust once again in God's faithfulness and the promises that he has made with all of us. You see, through Jesus, we are now partners or part of God's covenant. He has chosen all of us as we are, wherever we might be in our lowly and sinful state. While we are still rebelling against God, God calls us and he chooses us. He invites us to be part of his covenant. And he does not choose us for what we have done or for what we can do for God. And when he chooses us, he wants to shower us with his goodness. And everything that God promised to do is ultimately for our own good. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that God is going to give us the earthly things that we desire, because that would be prosperity gospel here. I'm not trying to condone or, preach prosperity here. But when I'm saying God wants to give us his goodness, I'm talking about the ultimate goodness that he has promised us. I'm talking about his promise that he will be with us wherever we go, that we will never be alone. I'm talking about the promise that he made, that he will have our names written, engraved on the palm of his hands. The promise to give us rest when we're tired and weary. When Jesus says, come to me, all of you who are burdened, and I'll give you rest. And I'm talking about this wonderful promise that God has made to us, in that he is preparing a house for us, our eternal home. And we're talking about this wonderful promise that his steadfast love will be with us forever. As we think about our lives, I wonder if there are some of us who are satisfied with what we have accomplished so far in terms of the security that we might have gained through our work, our financial stability. Perhaps we're satisfied with the home that we have built for ourselves. And maybe, and just maybe, just like David, sometimes we might feel like we need to do something for God in response. Perhaps we are focused on the things that we have acquired, that God has given us here on this earth, that perhaps we are not remembering the true covenant, the true gift that God has promised us through Christ. And so as we reflect on the covenant that God had made with David and the covenant that he has made with each one of us, I pray that we would remember that we are still very much dependent on him. We are so desperately dependent on his steadfast love. And just like how God told David, David, you think you've made it? You think now you've got everything? No. Let me tell you what you still need. And these are all the things that I want to give you. Let's hear God's voice, the Spirit perhaps whispering into our hearts that says, you think you've made it in this world. You have your house, you have your career, you have that bank account, and maybe you feel secure where you are now. But let me remind you of all these wonderful things that you still need. The better things, the eternal things that you actually should be looking forward to. Let us remember this wonderful covenant that Christ has written with his blood. Let us reflect on this everlasting, steadfast love of the one who will ultimately build our eternal house as we enjoy being in his presence, in his kingdom that will last forever and ever.